Hello chess fans, today we're going to be talking about how to beat the London system and this is going to be a comprehensive guide on different ideas and different strategies that you can employ in order to finally defeat the very solid system that is the London system. So without wasting any time, let's begin. After d4, we play knight to f6. White plays bishop to f4, so this is the beginning of the London system. White can also start with knight to f3 in this position, but it will probably transpose because here we play d5 anyways, and then bishop f4 would just transpose into the system that we want, or that we don't want, but the one that we're trying to beat. So after bishop to f4, there are a couple of different setups that we can employ. So we can either go for g6 and fianchetto this bishop, which is very solid. We can play for d5 and bishop f5, which is basically the copycat. We can play d5 e6, which keeps the bishop on c8 behind the pawn chain. As you can see, if the pawns are on e6 and d5, this bishop cannot get out. However, it will be developed to b7 later on, so more like a long-term play. Or we can play, in my opinion, the best way to play a d5 and then c5. This is the sharpest way to challenge the London, and in my opinion, it is the most fun as well. It's the most dynamic, and it is a lot of fun. Okay, I will start with the sidelines. I will start with g6. So after bishop to f4, we play g6, white plays e3, bishop g7, normal developing, knight to f3, d6. So we are playing a King's Indian setup against the London system. If you play King's Indian, you know that this is what we do. We put the pawns on g6 and d6, put the bishop on g7, put the knight on f6, and we either want to play for knight d7 and e5 in the future once we prepare it, or c5. So those are the two main ideas. So white plays bishop e2. Now why does white play bishop e2 and not bishop d3? Bishop d3 in this case is weaker for two main reasons. One is that this bishop is looking at a fianchetto structure. Pawns on h7 and f7 defend g6, and this bishop looking this way, it doesn't do anything. It's biting into granite, as we like to say in chess, because it's looking at a pawn that is defended quite a bit, so there's no breakthrough there. And the second reason why bishop d3 is bad is because various e5, e4 ideas can come with tempo. So for example, let's say as black we castle, white castles, we play knight to d7, and let's just say that white is not careful. Let's say white plays moves like c3, rook e8, and a move like queen e2, which is a blunder. Here we play e5 with a tempo, and after takes bishop g3 or bishop g5, doesn't really matter. Let's just say bishop g3. e4 is a fork, so this e5 e4 idea lends with a tempo and a fork, so you have to be very careful if you are playing with the white pieces. Now it's not necessarily losing. White can avoid this with moves like bishop to g3, for example, but there's always a threat, and this bishop on d3 is going to be a target. Black is going to use this bishop as a tempo winning resource or something like that. So going back, that's why bishop is placed on e2 for white and not on d3. And after knight h5, going after the bishop on f4, white plays bishop to g5. This is a common idea, by the way. We will see this more later on. After knight h5, bishop g5, h6, bishop to h4. Here we play c5, and the white cannot take because bishop on g7 would take the pawn on b2 and then take the rook, of course. If the pawn's already on c3, like if white plays a different move order, like if white plays c3 here and we get into the same sequence, in this position c5 is not strong because we lose our right to castle, and this is not very good. If this is something that happens, you can prepare c5 with moves like knight to d7. For example, you can go knight d7 and then c5. Just as a note, that's what I wanted to add. So going back here, c5. Now white plays c3 in this line. We play g5, bishop to g3, and queen to c7. And this is basically the opening that we are going to get. And now we are going into the middle game. The plans here are quite, I wouldn't say simple, but they're straightforward. We go knight d7, we continue developing. We can leave this bishop here on c8 for a little bit. We go knight d7, continue developing, take this bishop at some point as well, get the two bishops, castle, and work on opening up the center with maybe moves like e5 to completely shatter the center and open everything up. So those are going to be the plans. You take the bishop, you get the two bishops, you castle, and because you have the two bishops, you want the position open, you try to open up the position. So that is the general plan. Let's say white takes on c5, you take back with the queen, knight d2, takes on g3, h takes g3, knight c6. You don't have to remember all of these moves specifically, but just as a general idea, you should remember them, queen to b6, and this is the kind of position that we can get. I prefer black here, just because the position, just because black has two bishops and the position is quite open, which favors the two bishops over two knights. It's still equal at the computer level, but it is a more pleasant game for black, in my opinion. So that is the g6 system. Now let's move on to a different way to play. Let me just go back to that position again. So here, instead of going for ideas like g6 and d6, we can play d5, and then after bishop f4, we can play bishop f5. This is the copycat variation, as I like to call it. We're copying our opponent's moves, and we're going to go through this one pretty quickly because that's pretty much all we do. White plays e3, we play e6, bishop d3. Here we trade, and then we can play bishop d6. However, it gets a little bit dangerous after queen b5. Now this is still equal, but you have to be careful. You can't play moves like c6, for example, because then the rook is hanging. You have to go knight d7, give up this pawn, and after rook b8, give up another pawn. And this is equal according to the computer. However, you have to be precise here, and I would not recommend this because you're down a pawn, right, at the end of the day. But you know, it is equal, and this is something that you can play for if you want to. But instead of playing bishop to d6 immediately, I would recommend playing c6, stopping queen b5, and our next move is going to be bishop d6. So white castles, we go bishop to d6, bishop takes, let's say queen takes, queen b3, attacking the pawn on b7, we drop the queen back to c7, defending, and then we can even play knight d7, queen b6, and we get a position like this. I think that these positions are very dry. Now, what white can do instead of trading the bishops off here is white can maybe play for ideas like knight to e5. However, in these lines, you will go knight h5 and go after this bishop again. You can play like this and then put the queen on c7, put the knight on d7, and put a lot of pressure on these pieces. This is another way to play this position, which is totally fine. These ones are a bit more dynamic. However, if white wants to, white can just trade the bishops off and go into this position, which is totally equal. But you know, there's not a lot of winning chances here. So that's why I would not recommend playing into this variation. I think other options are much more dynamic. Okay, so that is the copycat variation. So let me go back now and talk about a different one. So after d5 here, bishop to f4, black plays early e6. So here we are blocking in our bishop. However, we are preparing c5 once again, or bishop d6, and that is how we want to continue playing. So after e6, white continues normally. White plays e3 because white wants to develop the bishop to d3, put the pawn on c3, get the famous pyramid structure here. You know, this is the mark of the London system. We play bishop to d6. White goes bishop to g3, because now if we take, white opens up the rook's file, and this might be slightly dangerous. But we just castle here. We don't take just yet. Bishop d3. We play pawn to c5. You know, white plays c3, queen c7, knight b d2, knight b d7. So normal developing. Now, one note that we have to make here is we don't go to c6. The reason why we don't go to c6 is because white takes this pawn. We cannot recapture because our queen's already on c7 in this line. If you didn't put the queen on c7, then you can play for knight c6, but you have to be slightly careful here, because in this line we put the queen on c7, so we cannot put the knight on c6. We will lose this pawn. And after bishop g3, hg3, it's very difficult to win this pawn back. It's near impossible. Next move, white will go b4, and white is doing totally fine here. Actually much better, not totally fine. It's much better for white, because we're not winning this pawn back. So that's why you have to put the knight on d7 in this line and not on c6. And after castles, we play b6, so we develop the bishop this way to b7. Let's say white plays e4. White can play many different things here, and black will most likely get a decent position. It doesn't matter what white will play, because what you should do as a black is you should take on d4. Well, take on g3 first, sorry, and then take on d4. The reason why we want to take on d4 first is because we're threatening knight to c5. So if knight takes, then we go knight c5, and this is a tempo on the bishop. And if the pawn takes, then we are giving white an isolated pawn, which is not always bad, but in this case, because of the piece placements, I would say that this is pretty bad for white, because we're trading off all the pieces here, and white has an isolated pawn. We're going to blockade the pawn. Let's say after knight e4, bishop e4, we can go bishop to b7, rook c1, we can play queen b8. It doesn't really matter. We're trading the pieces off. Knight to f6, takes, and we get a position like this where white has an isolated pawn. It is equal, but white has to be way more precise here, because isolated pawn is good when all the pieces are on the board, but if the pieces get traded off, then this pawn becomes a weakness. So in this case, it is starting to become weaker and weaker, and then rook d8, queen to d5, we're putting a tremendous amount of pressure on the pawn. So that is why going all the way back here, white doesn't have to play for e4, white can play for c4, and this keeps the game a bit simpler because it's a bit more symmetrical, but the position still remains in the balance regardless. But here there are less winning chances, though. I will say it's difficult to win this position as black because there are less dynamic play. In the e4 line, at least we can sort of force an isolated pawn, because there are disadvantages to taking with the knight, because there's a tempo on the pawn and the bishop itself. So that is why I don't really like this line either, because white can play c4 and we still get a position which at the end of the day is going to be super dry again, and it's difficult to win. There's not a lot of winning chances here. But you can play this, and it is definitely equalizing, and it is definitely a strong line for black. Okay, now let's talk about the main line, the main line. So in the main line, after d4, knight f6, bishop f4, d5, all the normal moves, white plays e3. Here we play this move c5. And what c5 does is it challenges the center immediately. It also offers up the pawn, but it should not be taken this early. And our plan is to go knight to c6, queen b6, and take advantage of the fact that white moved this bishop from c1, so it no longer defends the pawn on b2. So in this position, the main move is knight to f3 or c3. And these are the two main moves, but they will likely transpose. The line that I want to show you first, though, is this line, which is a side line, but I want to cover this first because I can get through it quickly. After d takes c5, we go e6, and let's say white tries to keep this pawn by force. You know, white goes b4. We challenge the pawn on a5. White plays c3, takes, and here we have to be very careful. We are fine, but we have to be very careful. The idea that we want to play is this move b6. However, there is a tactical problem with b6. Well, first of all, the reason why we want to play b6 is because we're challenging all of this, right? So if the pawn is taken, that's very bad because of bishop b4, knight d2, and here queen takes b6. We're winning back the pawn, and we have a tremendous amount of pressure. However, in this position, white doesn't have to take, and white won't. What white will do is white will take on b8, and after rook takes b8, white can play this move bishop to b5 check. And if we block this check with either bishop or the knight, white has c6. And this is winning on the spot, because if the bishop goes back, then c7 is winning the queen. So after this check, we cannot block, we have to move the king, and of course this is bad as well. Right, everything is very bad here. Now, the way we deal with this is, instead of playing b6 immediately, we play bishop to d7, which controls the diagonal, and next move we will play b6. For example, if knight d2, now we play b6, and then we are going for this pawn here. If white tries to keep this pawn by force or something with a move like queen c2, we take, and then we go queen to a5, which double attacks this pawn. There's also pressure here, so the knight is pinned. There's also pressure here, which means that, well, okay, rook c1, this pawn's not really hanging because there are tactical issues, but the thing is here we can put a lot of pressure on this knight, on this pawn. This knight will come to c6 at some point, but this is a very strong and active position for the black pieces. And we are also winning back the pawn. We're putting pressure here, we're putting pressure there as well. So that is a very strong position. So what white has to do is white probably has to take on b6. I don't think there is a better move here. And then we go, we take on b4 first, and then we take on b6. We can't take on b6 first because white will play a3 and then guard the pawn on b4. Now this is still fine because of various ideas with bishop to a4. However, it's getting tricky, and I would like to avoid this if possible, and it is certainly possible. We can take on b4 first. So that's what happens if white decides to take on c5 early. However, what white will most likely do is white will play knight to f3, we play knight to c6, and here there are two lines. There's knight to d2 immediately, and there's c3. Now, c3 is what you will face in most of your games, because this is the most played move in this position. However, knight d2 is the most played move by the masters, and this is, in my opinion, also the best move in the position. So let me talk about this one first. What's the idea here? What knight d2 does is it develops the knight first and foremost, and secondly, it keeps this pawn flexible. White doesn't commit the pawn to c3 because white might want to play pawn to c4 and blast open the position, blast open the center. So here what we do is we play this move queen to b6, attacking this, and also double attacking the pawn on d4. And here what white can do is take on c5, and this goes into a super tricky line where you have to be very careful as the black pieces. You can take the pawn on c5, you can take the pawn on b2. The best move is to take the pawn on b2. However, you need to be very careful because after rook b1, queen to c3, blocking the c pawn, also pinning the knight. White plays bishop to b5, e6, white castles, and here in this exact position we need to be very, very careful. If we take the pawn on c5 immediately, what white will do is white will play this bishop to e5 idea, taking advantage of the fact that this knight is pinned and we have to move the queen to a5, and after we move the queen, white goes knight d4. After bishop d4, bishop c6 first, takes. This position is slightly favorable for white according to the computer. However, there's a very specific reason why it's preferred by the white, and let me show you why. After queen d8, white has this idea of rook b3 and then rook to h3. So this is the reason why white is better. Now, are your opponents going to know that? No, I would say definitely not. However, it is still a tricky idea to take the pawn on c5. It is still very tricky because this move of bishop to e5 is so dangerous. That's why we play bishop to e7 first. Here, bishop e5 is not a threat because we would take the pawn with the queen. And after bishop e7, white plays e4, trying to blast open the center. We castle e5. And after knight d7, this is where I'm going to stop this line because it's already getting super in depth, and I don't think this position is something you're going to play often. And I'm trying to be practical in these videos, but whenever you get to this position right here, where you take on b2 and then come back to c3, be careful of this bishop e5 move. Always have this in mind because this forces the queen to move to an uncomfortable position, and then you can get hit with a lot of tempi. So you do not want that to happen. So going back, what we can do instead, not instead, but what white can do instead of playing knight bd2 is white can also play c3. And this is the move that you're going to see most often. So in this position, there's two ways to handle the position for black. And both ways have to do with this bishop being on f4. One way to handle this is to play queen b6 and immediately go after this pawn because the bishop left the c1 square. We're trying to take advantage of that. And this is the most played move in this position. However, I'm going to recommend a second move. And this move, I think, is an improved version of queen b6. And the move is knight to h5. Now, with knight h5, you're going after the bishop directly. And what will happen in most lines is after a couple of moves, you're going to end up playing queen b6 anyways. And you're going to get into a position where you have a queen b6, queen b3 type of position. However, it is an improved version for black because knight h5 is a very strong inclusion. So here white plays, let's say, bishop to g5, we play h6, bishop h4, and now we play queen b6. And here, let's say white plays the most natural move, queen b3. What we can do is we can kick the bishop back and then kick the knight back as well, and then play c4. Now, these moves are tricky. What's going on here? First of all, we are using this side of the board, basically the placement of this bishop and this knight to take space with g5, g4. So that's number one. Secondly, after c4, what we want white to do is we want white to take the queen on b6. And there's no better alternative here. So white really should take on b6. And you might think that this position and these doubled pawns are very bad. However, it's actually quite strong because this rook on a8 is open now. It's pressuring the pawn on a3. And also b5, b4 is a very strong idea. For example, if white plays knight d2, which is a good move, here we play b5. And if white tries to play a3, we go b4 anyways. And the reason why we can do that is because the pawn is pinned. The a pawn is pinned because the rook on a1 is undefended. White never had the time to protect this rook. So after c takes b4, we go knight takes b4, rook to c1, and the play goes on like this. We can always retreat back to c6, and this structure is quite strong for us. but that is what white will not do. Instead, white should play this move bishop to h4, no longer allowing black to take the bishop on g3, and here we play this move f5, and our idea is to play e5 and open up the position, get the knight to e5, and then develop your bishops. Your king will go to f7 in this line. This is the most interesting line in my opinion, super dynamic, and also quite strong as well. But the general ideas are b5, b4, and moves like f5, taking the bishop on g3, getting the two bishops, and then opening up the position with e5 once again. So those are the plans. I really like this line. However, I'm going to show what happens after queen b6 regardless. This is the main move in this position. It's not knight h5, even though I prefer knight h5 more. Queen b6 is the main move. And here the difference is after queen to b3, c4, queen b6, a b6. This is a bit more stable. This position is still decent for black, don't get me wrong. But white will most likely be more prepared here because this is one of the most common lines that is played in this position, and also it is not as strong in general as the other line. So here white plays this move knight to a3, and the idea is to go either knight to b5, or in some lines even retreat the knight to c2, which defends the rook, and white plays a3. That is also a possibility, although black's next move, bishop f5, totally disallows that. However, if black plays a move like e6, for example, the knight goes to c2, and now all of white's problems are basically solved. In this case, white can play a3, and b5, b4 is no longer possible because now the rook is defending on a1, so it's the a pawn is no longer pinned to the rook. So that is the possibility. Now the general plan for black is still going to be b5, and after a3, what black wants to do, black can do a couple of different things. Black can continue developing with bishop e7 castles. There are also various interesting ideas with knight d7, knight b6, and then knight to a4. This is a common rerouting idea in this structure for this knight, and this knight on a4 pressures b2, and it is a very interesting position for the black pieces. Of course, you shouldn't go here immediately. You should continue developing with bishop e7, but it is an idea that you can employ. But once again, after c3, I prefer knight h5. I think this is a stronger line. And then you can go queen b6 and get an improved version of the queen b6 position. So that is going to be it for today. I think this is probably one of the best ways to play against the London system, and I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one. If you like the video, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel, and that's going to be it. Goodbye.